Hi, yes, thank you so much for coming today to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund's June membership meeting, Decoding Censorship. I am Jordan Smith. I'm the digital editor of the CBLDF. For those of you who don't know, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the First Amendment rights of the comic arts community and also providing legal support for creators, retailers, educators, librarians, and fans. We have a great group of panelists today. So just two things before we start. Today's panel will be recorded, so we'll be posting it later for those who have missed it or so you can rewatch it. So just to give you fair warning, it's going to be recorded. And also, if you'd like to ask a question today for the panelists, you can type it down below in the question and answer box. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can today, and we will leave some time set aside at the end to hopefully answer any of the questions we don't get to during the panel. We have a ton of topics to cover today, so I am going to hand it over to our moderator for today, the interim director, Jeff Trexler.
Hi, thanks, Jordan. Censorship in comics has been going on for practically since the beginning of the modern expression of the medium here in the United States, when comics were seen as a threat to children's education, a threat to literacy, and of course, a threat to morality. But since the 1930s, 40s, and especially the 1950s, a lot has happened. A lot has happened legally, and a lot has happened in terms of the evolution of the medium itself. As the comics media have expanded from comic books and newspaper editorial cartoons and the comics page of newspapers to webcomics, animation, animated games, and of course, sort of integrations of word of text that you can see of all sorts in your handheld or in virtual reality. And as media have grown, as forms of self-expression have grown into social media and even Zoom, we've seen a new wave of imposing standards over communication. We've also seen changes in scope in terms of how people are punished. And even though here in the United States, the number of arrests have gone down, we've also seen a rise in arrests for comics and comics-related communication worldwide. So here to discuss that phenomenon, we've assembled an amazing set of panelists. And I wonder, before we talk, if you all wouldn't just mind just giving a brief introduction of who you are and where you're from. So I'll start with Jackie.
Yeah, I'm Jackie. I am from the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit group that defends student and faculty rights on college campuses.
Gordon?
Yeah, hi, I'm Gordon Daly. I'm with the National Coalition Against Censorship. We are also a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization. We're actually a coalition of many, many organizations, including CBLDF. And we do two things. We advocate for the free speech rights of artists and also for the free speech rights of K through 12 students, teachers, and librarians.
Excellent. Terry.
Hi, I'm Terry Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Cartoonist Rights Network International, which is a small NGO concerned with human rights abuses of cartoonists. For the most part, that has been in the past what you might call specifically editorial or political cartoonists, but it has included comic book artists, animators, and multidisciplinary visual artists as well. The organization is based in the United States, but as you might have guessed from the accent, I am not. So if you'll forgive me, I won't speak with absolute authority on any Supreme Court decisions or topics of that matter today. And as you've also seen, I have an interloper with me who, if I don't allow onto my lap, will make merry hell. So we will have company throughout the discussion.
Excellent. And Betsy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Gomez. I am the coalition coordinator for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. I've actually been working with CBLDF since 1998 when I started as a volunteer. And so as the coalition coordinator, I work with the Media Coalition and the Free Expression Network on coalition interests. And in addition to CBLDF, I'm also the coordinator for the Banned Books Week Coalition.
Excellent. As you can see, we have an amazing panel of experts here today. And to start, since we have been doing a lot of work in the education space, and yesterday we had a major decision in the realm of free speech and education. I would like to start with Jackie, just in terms of, I guess we have some positive developments, but also sort of the general field of concern you have with respect to free speech in the educational realm.
Yeah, it might be easier to answer what's not happening at this point. But like you said, we had a great decision come down yesterday. I guess I should preface everything as I'm not a lawyer, but we're very excited to see this. While the Mahanoy case is not technically a higher ed case, we're always happy to see students' rights protected. And, this was just such a unique set of facts, especially being an off-campus speech using digital platforms, which is something we haven't seen too much in the Supreme Court context. As more student rights are protected in the K-12 context, the more adept students will be to understanding their rights when they come onto campuses, and will be more primed for the wide kinds of discussions that they will have once they get there. So we're very excited about this. I think one thing I particularly wanted to point out was the one line in it noting that K-12 institutions are nurseries of democracy. This is something that I hope more folks start looking at these institutions as, these are the places where students can learn to express themselves, and we need to do our best to protect both student rights and academic freedom rights in these cases. And yeah, I guess a little bit broader than that, I guess I'll tell you guys about the past year at FIRE. It's, if you had asked me before the pandemic, I would have thought that we wouldn't have as many cases, everyone being at home. But contrary to my poor prediction, we had a 36% increase in case submissions from 2019 to 2020 from students and faculty alleging rights violations. We can attribute anecdotally, I think we can contribute a lot of that to both heightened political awareness and engagement around, issues of racial injustice, and also digital learning, which has been fascinating to watch. Between students getting in trouble for Zoom backgrounds, Zoom bombing events, and that becoming the new way to shout down speakers, and professor statements being recorded, it's really created a unique atmosphere around academic freedom issues and the way that students and professors interact with one another. And I'm sure we'll get into all the crazy legislation stuff briefly.
Yeah. I have a question. You brought up the nurseries of democracy, and it's been interesting to watch because, I guess 100 or so years ago, when you have people like John, or maybe I guess John Dewey, I don't remember the exact dates in which John Dewey was writing, but 80 to 100 years ago, you have when people were talking about schools as laboratories of democracy or nurseries of democracy, like John Dewey was seeing it primarily in terms of almost an instrumentalist thing. It didn't have values. It didn't have ideological values. It's about bringing everybody here together to interact. And, they had that melting pot metaphor. Today, there seems to be a shift. Is education, I guess, in J. Jonah Jason terms, is it education threat or menace when it comes to trying to express a point of view that is counter-majoritarian, that is sort of against the consensus of what a democracy should be, and is that, or is education still a place where people can express a full range of points of view through comics or whatever, even if it doesn't necessarily align with the consensus?
Yeah, we're hoping it stays as a place for all of that. I think that's where a lot of this ends up coming down to, is limiting what professors can teach is, hurts everybody. So, with the journals, sorry, I gotta catch my words here. Allowing these things to be taught does not mean there's an endorsement. And that's something that we're particularly careful about, is a professor assigning a controversial comic or reading does not mean they are endorsing it. A lot of times it's a way to critically look at it. And a lot of times students should engage in these materials critically, and professors need to make sure that they are grading things on a viewpoint neutral basis, you know, and not asking their students to specifically endorse points of view.
And do you see a big shift? Do you see a widening gap between the atmosphere at, say, private colleges and university and private schools versus public?
You know, I'm not sure if I have seen too much of a gap there. I mean, the issue there would be, you know, the public schools that are currently facing a lot of pressure from outside forces like legislation and such that are forcing them to, you know, stop teaching certain things. Like, I believe at, where was it? It was there's an Oklahoma statute, for example, that prohibits teachers in public institutions from making part of their course concepts about race and making discomfort or guilt around race. That is quite the broad stroke to paint here. And that's kind of an issue with the public schools here. You know, private schools obviously are allowed to come up with their own rules in regards to speech. They just need to be forthcoming with those rules and make sure their students are aware of them. And if they do, you know, promise academic freedom and freedom of speech, they need to live up to that. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, I'd be remiss not to mention is earlier this month or late last month, the AAUP released a report on COVID-19's impact on academic governance. And, you know, that's an interesting read if anyone wants to take a look. They found specifically among, I think, small private institutions that were already in financial burden and poor financial situations, that they were unilaterally shutting down academic programs and laying off tenured faculty without following their proper protocols in place and declaring financial indigency. And, you know, while FIRE doesn't necessarily take a stance on specific tenure rules, when universities stop following their rules and start doing these broad cancellations and firings without following their protocols, it is a huge issue that can, you know, end up affecting academic freedom.
Interesting. That line of consistency is very, the consistency between what you say you're doing and what you're actually doing is very interesting. And it's relevant to lots of areas of law, even outside of education, which brings me to Gordon. You know, Gordon, you said you were, you know, the NCAC is a coalition, which the CBLDF is a part. Sort of how are you seeing the climate changing as Jackie mentioned, how do you see the climate responding or changing, the climate changing or responding in light of COVID? Sort of what are we facing now? Like if we're a creator, a publisher, retailer, even a fan trying to access things that we might not have experienced in terms of censorship 50 years ago?
That's a good question. Before I answer that, I do want to point out one thing about yesterday's decision, which is sort of the sentence right before and after the nursery of democracy, which says that schools have an interest in protecting a student's unpopular expression, especially when it takes place off campus. And that protection must include protection of unpopular ideas. So we're really hoping to kind of run with that and argue that that's implying that like it says, it's not just that schools cannot punish unpopular ideas, but they actually have an affirmative duty to protect them. Anyway, that being aside, so that's a good question. You know, over the last year, when students have been, teaching or learning from home, I think we saw a little bit less frequency of challenges to student speech and challenges to books and books used in the curriculum. In part, obviously, challenges to student speech were a little bit less just because students were on campus, and so there's less disciplinary problems that might crop up. maybe, I'm not sure why we saw a little bit fewer challenges to books, but it might just have been just the natural sort of ebb and flow of these things. So, so I don't know, from our perspective, whether COVID, as far as I can tell, has had a huge impact. Obviously, when students are learning remotely, there's all sorts of legal issues that crop up, like this case yesterday. Are they on campus? Are they off campus? There was that one crazy case in which a student was disciplined because he was on screen during class, and I guess he had a toy gun on his desk or something like that. And so this is again the school sort of reaching into the student's home in a way that obviously we're not very pleased with. So yes, I don't know that there's been a huge impact of COVID per se on what we see. I did want to know, I don't know if we're going to be talking later more specifically about the critical race theory.
Happy to chat about it now if you'd like to raise it.
Yeah, because Jackie did mention, I think the one in Oklahoma, was it? There's so many, there's quite a few.
Yeah, quite a few.
But some of them, the Texas one, for example, says, oh, you can't teach these ideas at all. And that includes books that might include those ideas. But a lot of the other bills explicitly say things like, you can't require students to agree with these ideas. Or they explicitly say, nothing in this bill prevents these ideas of being discussed in an objective manner. So for those people who are in the audience who are interested in what's happening maybe in their state with these bills, we certainly encourage them to lobby their legislatures. If they're gonna pass these bills at all, they should definitely pass the more reasonable versions.
Just so you think that there's, in terms of reasonable versions, it's interesting when I took this position. And I started asking people in comics about what they thought I should do and what they thought the CBLDF should do. One of the first things that was raised to me was, we hope that you're going to retain your commitment against censorship of all stripes, and that you're not going to just start enforcing one point of view and saying it's okay to censor one type of thing, but other type, and particularly it's okay to censor if it goes against progressive values, but everything else, we still retain our anti-censorship over there. And so what is a good balance to strike here? I mean, is in the sort of communitarian libertarian point of view, with the progressive values now being dominant, you said there's a reasonable approach to CRT regulation. And I'm not just thinking in terms of laws, but also how publishers or social media platforms, or even banks and Shopify and retail platforms should handle it. What's a reasonable balance to strike? Is it everything should go a pure libertarian view? Is there something in between? Is there something where the only thing that's consistent with democracy is a progressive point of view? How do we work this out?
Gee, that's a hard question. I didn't realize I was going to get such tough questions.
No, you actually raised a really interesting thing. It got me thinking.
Our general perspective on these issues is that it's important that all views get heard on these things. And I have to say, I taught high school for a long time in California, in Oakland, and there were teachers, not a lot, there were some teachers who indoctrinated their students, and I know they did because I had students who complained about it, right? Which is inappropriate. There are some books that we see challenged quite a bit, which, there's one book which I won't mention, which explicitly tells the reader that if you agree with Booker T. Washington on particular issues, or with Roy Wilkins, who was the head of the NAACP in the 50s and 60s, if you agree with them on these racial issues, you're a coward. I mean, it literally says that, right? So there are legitimate reasons that parents might be upset about some of these books. And so I think it's incumbent upon, certainly upon teachers, but maybe to some extent upon authors to understand how some of these things might be perceived by people who don't agree with them, and to make an effort to make sure that, certainly in the K-12 realm, to make sure that you're not either intentionally or accidentally indoctrinating students or making students feel like they can't speak out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously, you know, the higher education is a little bit different because then it's not children for one thing, right? And presumably they're more able and willing to stand up for their own ideas. But certainly, if you're talking about works aimed at children, I think you have to be sensitive to the fact that this indoctrination is a problem. And I'm sure it happens in, you know, this was in the Bay Area in California, which is, you know, a liberal area. I'm sure indoctrination happens in schools in conservative areas on the other end.
Yeah, it is a tension. And I want to go back to a question that I had with Jackie, which was when we're talking about private schools and public schools. Do you make a distinction between efforts that are made, say, by a private company in the name of corporate social responsibility versus a government? Or do you see the concept of censorship extending into that realm where a platform has covers a broad sweep of the public? So for example, we're getting questions here at the CBLDF from people who, just last week, somebody who was kicked off of Kindle Digital. And we've had people who've, you know, lost their Shopify accounts or been kicked off of Facebook for something that they've posted. Do you see that in the same category of censorship, or is that something separate because it's a private platform that you don't want to deal with?
Well, I will say that we do deal with mostly on the artists being having their works taken down or even being, I guess, really taken off certain social media companies because they supposedly violate the terms of service. And so we definitely, I don't know a whole lot about that because I don't deal with the artists too much. But it's definitely something that we deal with regarding social media companies. We do get complaints and we do try and advocate with those companies on behalf of artists. You know, more generally, I mean, this is not, I don't know that NCAC has a position on this. My personal view is that, you know, these social media companies are such powerful actors that, you know, if I had my druthers, you know, they would be required to comply with First Amendment principles, just as if they were the government. That would be my personal view. And then I will note as an aside, you know, as far as schools are concerned, California for 30 years, 40 years has had a state law that says that private high schools and colleges and universities must comply with free speech principles.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so far the world has not crumbled into dust because of that, as far as I can tell.
Well, that's, yeah, California, that's a very interesting principle in terms of education. And I think one could make an argument, just given the roots of the internet in a government program, I mean, and the role that government has played in administering the internet and then through the internet, the web, there might be a legal wedge to get your point of view, although I know not everybody agrees. This question of the relationship of government and private companies is actually something that I'm really glad that Terry is here to talk about what's going on with governments or in other countries, because in the United States, when the CBLDF was founded, the big problem we were facing was people being thrown into prison. And that has gone down a lot, particularly as a lot of communication has moved, where the focus has gone away from comic shops and communities to people interacting with things electronically in their homes. But I understand that that's not the way it is in many other places around the world. And there's an interesting interplay between governments and private companies that we've been seeing most recently, say in eBay, which has a global anti-obscenity change in its obscenity materials policy after there's pressure from a number of companies with regard to a number of media, including manga. So I'm wondering, Terry, about your experience with censorship in comics, because this is what you focus on. And I've been reading your Twitter feed, and it's fascinating, the things that are happening worldwide.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you everyone for your contributions so far. It's a timely discussion. As far as social media is concerned, I think that in other parts of the world, and particularly Asia, to take an example, you're talking about a continent where, in those countries, of course, where these platforms can operate, because there's a few countries where they can, but where they can, the Facebook nexus in particular, Facebook and its kind of nest, if you like, nesting apps, plus Instagram, plus WhatsApp, for people in these countries, that is essentially the internet. That is the way that they search for information. That's the way they share information. That is their far and away their preferred tool, because it's, from their point of view, it's, first of all, it's reliable, and second of all, it's ubiquitous, it's easy. Everyone's kind of on the same page, so to speak, with it. But the difficulty is, to pick an example, in Bangladesh that we've been concentrating on recently, there's a cartoonist there, Ahmed Kabir Kishore, who was arrested last year for Facebook posts that he was making. Bangladesh has a particularly wide, vague Digital Security Act, which essentially enables the Bangladeshi government to arrest anybody, because for the vast majority of the citizens who are online, if you haven't yourself posted something that is objectionable, if it can be demonstrated that you've interacted with it in some way, that you've liked something, that you've retweeted something, that you've shared a link, that you are part of a page on Facebook or a group on Facebook where things that might not have anything to do with you, but things that are nonetheless objectionable, have been posted or written, that can be categorized as a conspiracy, because you're all part of the same group. You can be arrested at any time. And that's exactly what happened to Kishore. He had been producing cartoons through March and April of last year, largely about the coronavirus and the way that it was being handled in Bangladesh, expressing concerns about how PPE was being distributed and how the whole situation was being managed. Arrested at his home, interrogated. He alleges torture during that interrogation. He has certainly suffered permanent physical damage. He's lost hearing in one ear, and there were other signs of mistreatment when he came out of prison 10 months later. He's out on bail at the moment, but again is still in the frame for being criminalized. And so in a situation like that, you would hope that when these are posts that from an internationalist perspective are perfectly reasonable, you know, everyone pretty much in the last year has been talking about the virus one way or another. Most people have been concerned about the way their own government, wherever they are in the world, has been handling it. There's nothing unreasonable in there. From a human rights perspective, he's obviously completely within his rights in terms of freedom of expression, whether his rights to produce culture, to be an artist, and so on. So it's a totally defensible position. The consensus among freedom of speech and artistic freedom organizations would be, here is a person who is actually doing a public service ultimately by scrutinizing government. You would hope in a situation like that Facebook could come out with some sort of statement, back up their user first and foremost, but also back up the principle of free expression, which, if a social media platform is for anything at all, then expression presumably is what it's for. But time and again, we've seen silence, essentially, if not outright complicity, where a platform is perhaps threatened with suspension or closure or being brought down by a national government. The access is going to be denied in a particular country. An example that's on everyone's lips at the moment is Turkey. Turkey is demanding that all the major social media giants open offices in Ankara, have a staff within Turkey. Otherwise, they will not be allowed to continue to provide a service to people within Turkey. And it's very obviously so that they can be strong-armed. It's going to be so much easier to intimidate and curtail them if there's an office in Ankara or Istanbul where people can be arrested. if there's a place where documents or servers can be seized and so on. And again, you would hope that would be strongly resisted, but I believe Google have already said, yeah, they're going to comply, and they're going to open up an office in the near future once the pandemic and everything has calmed down. So that's the first kind of domino to fall. And Turkey, is one of our perennial concerns. It suppresses freedom of expression, critical voices, cartoonists on what you could describe as an industrial scale. So it's only going to become easier if the companies are forced into that position where they basically roll over, they kind of expose their soft underbelly and make it that much easier for an authoritarian regime to intimidate them. Can I just briefly pick up on the point about schools and race and so on?
Yeah, please do.
One of the cases that concerned us last year, and I'll share my screen briefly so that people can see the cartoon I'm talking about. This cartoon was produced by David Fitzsimmons in Arizona last year, obviously in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, editorial and political cartoons are quite often used in American classrooms, and even more so than comics, where a long form unpacking of an issue can have a bit more nuance. An editorial cartoon by its nature is something that is consumed very, very quickly, a single panel, and consequently it can come across as a lot more blunt, and in so doing, in inverted commas, offensive to those who wish to take offense. And so this particular cartoon was used in a classroom setting in Texas, and it escalated to the point where the governor of Texas was intervening and calling for people's jobs over the matter. I'll just read what we said at the time with regard to the cartoon itself, and again, picking up on what's already been said, that very important point about whether something in a classroom is there because everyone is expected to agree with it, or whether it's in the classroom because it's meant to be a starting point to get to an issue and to discuss it and to unpack it. So I wrote at the time, I dearly wish Texans aggrieved by what they felt they saw in this excellent Fitzsimmons cartoon would take a second look. The main subject of the cartoon is not the contemporary police officer, who is just the last in a series of avatars for oppression, but the identical African-American figure that is portrayed throughout. The bottom right corner of the composition is empty. Racism will assume yet another face in the future unless we eradicate it. In any case, the whole purpose and intent of an editorial cartoon is a reaction and one opinion on an issue, and in the context of educational use, students are not compelled to agree with it, but rather to examine that view and identify the historical events to which it refers. To dispense with cartoons simply because they evoke a reaction is an affront to the intelligence of the young and speaks to an insidious lack of trust in teachers. This culture war farrago cannot be allowed to establish a precedent. And so I think we can draw a line, horrible pun, in the context of cartoons and comics, between those kind of controversies last year, which it wasn't the only one, and what we're now seeing with the controversy over critical race theory, and it's happening in the UK as well. It's not just in the United States. Exactly the same conversation is happening where I am, where various conservatives, for the most part, are questioning, why are we even having this conversation? Why do we have to talk about slavery? Why do we have to talk about colonialism and imperialism? Questioning the patriotism, essentially, of educators and so on. So it's ongoing, and I am concerned that in terms of what we're going to be dealing with in the future, we're getting into a situation where essentially politics with a small p just isn't welcome outside of very, very strict lanes or paths. It's the same thing as what's happening right now with, again, in the UK, massive controversy at the moment about whether English footballers should or should not take the knee at the start of fixtures, and people howling about what's politics doing in sport, even though a cursory glance at the history of sport will show you how it's tied up, as everything is tied up with politics. So it doesn't, these things, the idea that politics doesn't belong is catching on. It's wrong-headed, and of course, if it does catch on, it's massive bad news for political editorial cartoonists, because it's their bread and butter.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Schools an important, as you said, with respect to the bread and butter, schools are so important because they can be a way for a comic to be propagated throughout a country if something gets used as a discussion point. But as you're saying, if things are being cut back, there's a serious problem, and it's something that not just schools, but throughout the entire culture. I've been thinking so much what you're saying here. It ties into what I know Betsy's been talking about here at the CBLDF with respect to legislation and the role of sort of law as a force to force people to take a position or not to speak a position on either side of the ideological, either end of the ideological spectrum. So before I get to the question, because we have an important question that's related to this very topic from Jamie, I wanted to hear what Betsy had to think about, what you have to say about this whole question about giving people these opportunities to express themselves and legislation getting in the way, particularly of expression through the comics medium.
Yeah, so in the time that I've been working with CBLDF, what I've seen is a transition from acute attempts at censorship, like arresting a retailer for selling allegedly obscene material, to these more kind of legislative attacks, and these more, in many regards, more organized attacks on education. We've got this legislation about CRT, obviously. And just to kind of pick up a thread from what Gordon was saying about the impact of COVID on censorship in schools, we're seeing fewer individual attempts to ban books, yes. But what we're seeing are more organized efforts to ban books that are kind of broader based. If you look at what's happening in Leander, Texas, with the attacks on their reading lists, these are reading lists that have been existed prior to the pandemic, but at the beginning of the pandemic, when people are feeling out of control, suddenly a lot of people are at home, they start reviewing these lists and they started raising complaints. It triggered a system-wide review of these lists, and comics are being disproportionately impacted as far as the titles that are being removed from the lists. And these are voluntary reading lists. These aren't required reading lists. In addition to that, what we're seeing over the past year were bills that would attempt to regulate LGBTQ plus content in classrooms, which would have impacted a lot of comics. There's a lot of LGBTQ plus content in comics. Those, for the most part, those bills have failed. Some of those bills, though, are really concerning because they would have redefined harmful to minors content in such a way that a teacher or a librarian could have been held criminally liable for sharing that content with somebody under the age of 18. So it could have raised the potential that somebody who shared Roe v. Harris is perfectly normal with a student in the course of sex education could have gotten in trouble because it has images in it. And that's incredibly terrifying as you know, for teachers and librarians who might be fined or even face prison time for sharing these constitutionally protected material with children, because the laws are being written in such a vague way that they're targeting constitutional content.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Leander, because there's one of the things we noticed in working with the people in Leander was, I guess you would call it code switching. So we would listen to the sessions by parents and they'd be saying, we need to stop these books because it was often very religious. You know, this is immoral, and we have this immorality in the classroom, and if we can't have our schools, you know, going against the way of God. And that when things were then discussed in the school board, these same parents would then be saying, oh, well, actually, we need to be concerned about students' mental health. We need to be concerned about it. And it was a very, almost, you could say, a woke vocabulary that was introduced to keep the books out. And it was sort of one thing in one community and another thing in another community. So it's as if, like I said, it's adaptive. People are learning.
Well, yeah, we're
so-
seeing that in the attacks on CRT content with those opposed to critical race theory using the language of those who support it against them. So
I want to open up to this question that Jamie, and I'll start with Betsy and then open it up to everybody, which is, okay, so we have laws trying to keep people from having certain material in schools. And I want to open this, there's a connection here to publishing and retail that I want to make in a second. But the question specifically is, when thinking about rights, should professors think about the right of students not to read an assigned graphic novel or comic based on triggers or other reasons? How can professors be sure to protect their right to assign potentially controversial comics for a class? So you have the professor's right, you have the student's right. How do you balance that?
can I speak to K through 12 schools just
Sure.
briefly? Okay. So at no point do we ever say a parent doesn't have a right to determine what their child reads. Parent absolutely has that right to determine what they read, and children are they know what they're comfortable with, and if they're not comfortable with something, they'll stop reading it. So what's concerning with the K through 12 level, though, is there are a lot of parents who are trying to take that right away from parents to determine that for their own children. We're seeing that in Leander, actually, one of the most active people involved in that case is a parent who's worried that her kid won't get to read some of this material that they're interested in because other parents are trying to get it removed from lists. And so a parent absolutely has a right to make a decision about what their kid reads. And a kid should have a right to say, hey, I'm not comfortable reading this. But when we let individuals take that right away from the entire community, we're limiting what a kid sees, because there is a lot of content that kids are perfectly comfortable with that parents think they're not comfortable with or think is bad for them. And we don't appreciate just how sophisticated students are these days. And how they read and what they engage with and what they understand.
So you're talking about K through 12, and it kicks me right back to Jackie with higher education. Students are really aware of their rights in a way that when I went to college, we weren't thinking about rights. We weren't thinking about it in the same way. It's much more of a narrow thing. Rights issues were things that happened to other people who were oppressed elsewhere. They really weren't, that's what a lot of the protests were. But people are really sensitive to their rights now. When in your work in fire, do you see that there's a right to students not to engage certain material, to not have to face certain material? And how do you deal with that balance?
Yeah, so I mean, generally speaking, professors have the academic freedom right to choose what's taught in their class and to set the tone and the pace and the actual content of the course. But what we really try to encourage students to do is to, take their learning into their own hands. And when a professor gives you a syllabus, and if there are certain topics for you that you're sensitive to, or, things you would rather not engage with, go through your syllabus and look at the required reading, and then have a conversation with your professor about it to make sure it's the right class for you. The issue of a student trying to get materials taken off of a syllabus or a required reading list ends up infringing on the professor's right. And it's an old case, but I love it so much, and it's related to comics, so I can bring it up. In 2015, we had a case at Crafton Hills College where it kind of speaks to your point about woke language being flipped on its head and used by conservative students, where a student was taking a comic book or a graphic novels related course and thought that they would just be reading Batman and Robin, which is hilarious because they don't actually know what happens in a lot of those comics because they can be very graphic.
Yes, they can.
But they called for the books to be eradicated from the system, and they, I believe they asked for trigger warnings to be placed on syllabus. And while, we support the rights of professors to choose whether or not they're using trigger warnings, it ends up having a chilling effect on what they put on their syllabus and what they choose to teach. Because if they can't properly predict everything that is going to supposedly trigger a student, they could run into issues by saying, well, why didn't you label this as, having X, Y, and Z content in it, where they might not have actually known, or, they might have just accidentally forgotten to include as one specific trigger warning. But yeah, usually just for us, it comes down to, professors have the right to choose what's going to be taught in class, and encouraging students to really take their education into their own hands and make sure that they're comfortable and have these conversations with their teacher, and see where those go.
So it's almost a dialectical approach. You're just dialogue, question, conversation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these end up being in like elective courses, so it's you really should take that time when you choose a course to make sure it's right for you.
Yeah, that Crafton Hills College course was an elective, and the student actually asked her parents to help with her opposition to the course.
What do you think about, and I'll throw this out to everybody, what do you think about the movement where we have things going on in colleges where students have learned that they can make their objections, and their objections have power, right? They can affect what a professor assigns, they can get a professor fired, they can get a staff member fired. Their sense of what's right or what's wrong in any given comic or book or anything is something that has to be respected. So what do you all feel about the current movement to have employees' rights respected in terms of what a publisher or a social media company can or cannot put on its site or put on in its catalog?
This is, I have a problem with this whole concept of, in the question, for example, do students have the assumption that students have a right not to read this, or that, as you say, employees have a right not to be working, for a company that publishes or right to have their company not publish something which they disagree with. This whole concept of rights in that sense, I think, is really dangerous, because I've done a lot of criminal defense work in my day, and the argument once upon a time used to be that yes, criminal defendants have rights, but what about the right to be safe, right? Well, once you start phrasing that as a right, then you're basically obliterating the individual right. See what I'm saying? So framing these things as a battle of rights, I think, is really dangerous. Because if you're talking about the right of one person versus the rights of 1,000 people, obviously the 1,000 people win. If you're talking about the rights of one person versus the interests of 1,000 people, now maybe that right of one person trumps the interests of those people. So I'm just very uncomfortable with the framing of this in terms of rights, the right not to be harmed, etc.
What do you think about the way things are being framed in terms of almost? I come from a lawyer's background who's worked in this area in terms of Title VII and Title IX, where everything is framed in a rights perspective. You could also think of it sort of in the language of HR, that certain comics, say if you're signing the works of Robert Crumb, and then we say, oh, well, you're creating a hostile environment in the school, or you're creating a hostile work environment if it's something that's being published. How do you deal with that kind of argument, where you're grounding the content of the work itself as something that is within that framework of hostile environment, which can be grounds for getting something, say, out of a school setting or out of a workplace?
I'm not super conversant with the law around that, but my understanding is that would be simply saying that there's this picture I don't like, or that's offensive or pornographic or whatever, constitutes a hostile environment. As I understand it, is quite the stretch, right? Isn't that? Don't you have to have a whole lot more than that to have a hostile environment? So again, that's just goes to what I was saying before, is again, if you're going to frame that as a right, then of course you can censor, which is why I push back on framing it as a right.
Fair enough.
I think and I agree with Gordon on this. I think one of the things I find concerning is that a lot of people equate discomfort with harm. And, in the course of the years I've worked with CBLDF, we've encountered material I'm not comfortable with, but it didn't harm me. and it's material that has there is a right for that material to exist. And, you know, I think in intellectual freedom, we're not doing our job right if we're not also defending material we disagree with. And so what concerns me is that that we're not looking at this as legitimately harmful scenarios where somebody is going to be legitimately hurt, either physically, mentally, emotionally. And what we're dealing with is content that makes people uncomfortable because they either disagree with it politically. The speech could be, quite frankly, icky. You don't like it, but is it actually harmful? And so, you know, I think that's one of the things we're dealing with here.
I think that's an important distinction to make. It reminded me, I'm looking at the opinion yesterday where Justice Breyer talks about it's not enough that something that the work makes you uncomfortable, that it or even offends you. It has to be something more substantive than that in terms of it to be a disruption in terms of the Tinker standard. But I think you can apply the same thing with harm. I'm wondering, to get to Terry, and then we'll throw up into the whole group again. And by the way, if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to raise them in the chat or in the Q&A. I come from a background doing legal reform and democracy reform in Russia back when, after the Soviet Union. And one of the things that we tried to stop and didn't succeed in stopping was the notion of putting in the constitution that the government had the right to take action against things that were deemed to be a threat to national integrity. And in Russia, that's been used to exclude, you know, not just individuals, but there was a recent law about against any content, including comics, that portrayed same-sex relationships. And so that's a very controversial thing going on right now. How do you deal with the fact that there are government officials who see what they're doing in terms of persecuting comics as something that is their responsibility for promoting a healthy polity, for promoting a stable government or stable regime? How do you respond to this? Because I know in the United States, it's very easy to protest something, but how do you deal with those arguments that what they're doing is in fact legal?
The number one bit of snark we get is no cartoon ever brought down a dictator. You know, to which the response is, going to tell the dictators that because they seem to think they've got something to worry about. So you're right that in a lot of cases that we've seen, the kind of material at issue is often, you know, the kind of cartoons that would probably pass without much comment actually in other parts of the world, but depending on the context in which they're being disseminated, they're being conflated with, as you say, Jeff, treason, sedition, terrorism, outright terrorism in some instances. Again, in the past few years, that's increasingly been the case. The terrorism as a context for these kind of prosecutions, and of course, a truly corrupt and authoritarian regime will just find any route that they can take. Ultimately, if they want to silence a cartoonist, you know, there's been other cases where we know that what's at the heart of the case is the cartoons that have been drawn. But again, to use Turkey as an example, Erdogan there took Musa Kart, the cartoonist, to court 3 times, failed in prosecutions that were based on specific cartoons on the first 2 occasions, and then the third was successful. But on that occasion, Musa wasn't in the dock because of any particular cartoon that he had drawn. It was unbelievably down to his choice of travel agent. And because they were saying that his travel agent was a front for and supporting laundering money on behalf of terrorists, that his choice of travel agent betrayed his allegiances with terrorism. So they'll find their way through, you know, one way or other. If there isn't a law that exists, as I mentioned before, the Security Act in Bangladesh, or the laws that exist in Algeria, where it's an offence to insult the state, to insult the military, to insult the police. If those laws aren't on the statute books, then a real despot will just find something else to pin on you if that's what they want to do. All we can do externally, of course, is either, if possible, seek to give that cartoonist safe harbor, try and get them out of harm's way if that's what's happening, or try to get as much as we can do pressure from outside. Again, in the case of Bangladesh last year, which was probably our biggest, number one most egregious case, in the end we were able to get 3 of the UN special rapporteurs to write with an intervention to the government in Bangladesh. Again, especially in the context of the pandemic, to needlessly expose people to the risks that come with being a prisoner is kind of it's doubly troubling, because there's the initial injury, if you like, curtailing their freedom over something that's a fundamental right. But then, as we know, prisoners have been more exposed to risks during the pandemic than people in the general population. And in actual fact, in some cases, treatments and vaccines and so on have been actively withheld from the prison population, while other sections of society have been getting treatment. So in that context, it really was completely unacceptable that someone should be jailed over cartoons. So it's challenging, and as I say, it's only getting more commonplace. I wish it weren't the case, but the trend was already up, and the pandemic's just exacerbated every trend that there was to detect. I think that in terms of what the average person can do, I always say that if you are lucky enough to live somewhere where freedom of expression is in relatively robust health, then exercise it. Don't take it for granted. If things on social media are you find are being taken down or struck or what have you, challenge those decisions as much as you can. Support organizations that have a program that supports freedom of expression, as we all kind of come back to life as normal, and we return to life as it was before the pandemic, bit by bit. Support the news gathering organizations where you are, particularly the smaller ones, the local ones. Support your libraries, because these really are the kind of infrastructures that are most threatened and are likely to disappear. And from a completely personal point of view, if your newspaper or your local news provider doesn't have a cartoonist, ask them why. Be a pain on that topic, because again, the feedback that we're getting from a lot of quarters is that increasingly editors see them as just more trouble than they're worth.
Yeah, well, we're definitely
because half the population doesn't like them, and it's like, well, that's the point. The only cartoon that pleases everybody is the kind of milksop, isn't Father's Day nice? We all love our dads in a cartoon, and everyone gives that a nice feedback. But you talk about whoever's in the White House, or you talk about whatever bills passing through or what have you, then half the population are not going to be particularly pleased with the cartoon.
This is actually before we wrap up, and I'm going to have one question for everybody, one question that I'd like everybody to answer in a second. But Louise asked this question that really taps into something you all have been talking about, which is, all right, we've talked about, offense versus actual harm, whether it's disruption of the educational environment or actual harm to a person. Louise asks, what would actual damage to a reader of a contested comic look like? Has anyone ever defined that? I mean, it's a very interesting question. What for each of you, what would be enough to justify sort of taking something out of the marketplace? I mean, in the United States, I think we have one answer, which is we have the obscenity question, which is obscene materials outside the First Amendment. What kind of damage would be enough to get you to think that, well, maybe this goes too far? Is it possible?
I mean, if it's actually defamatory, and like you said, if it really crosses already established limits to the First Amendment, then it can be taken out, but it would need to be, you know, actually
if it's inciting a
defamatory,
riot.
actually incite. Yeah. And I don't know the last time I've seen anything that's done much of that.
Yeah, I'm not going to push back against this idea that just because speech causes harm, therefore it can be censored. I mean, look at that case with those crazy Baptist church that was protesting the the dead soldiers' funerals and saying your son is going to hell, and that speech certainly caused harm to those parents. I mean, I can't imagine it didn't. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court said, and rightfully so, that they had the right to speak on, you know, political issues. Just because it causes harm. Yeah, so I'm very comfortable with the very, very, very narrow limits that the Supreme Court has put down on speech.
Yeah, we saw an attempt in California just a few years ago where they tried to regulate violent speech with Brown versus EMA, based on alleged evidence, kind of like what happened when the Comics Code was passed in the 50s, that violent video games harm children. And that evidence in reality doesn't exist. And so CBLDF and Media Coalition, a number of organizations helped get that law struck down because it would have added violent speech to the limits of the First Amendment. And it would have had broad implications for other media, including comics.
Well, that segues to my last question. I want to thank you all for being here. This has been really interesting. And obviously, you've been sparking a lot of thoughts in my own mind here. But what, in the history of comics, we talk a lot about Frederick Wertham in the 1950s and the Comics Code. And the Comics Code ended in, you know, just a little over a decade ago. Just in one sentence, what do you think that people, whether they're reading comics, selling comics, making comics, what's the number one thing today that we need to be concerned about? And I'll start with Jackie.
Oh, that's a big question for one sentence.
I'll give you two if you want.
I'll try my best. But I would say one of the things I want people to give more consideration to is that these issues are not historical. You can go on your guys' website, American Library Association's website, and see all these attempts at censorship. And, you know, there is a great documentary that I hope people watch that you guys profiled recently called Boiled Angels that details, you know, the trial of Mike Diana in 1994 and being charged with and convicted of obscenity, you know, in recent years. So these things are still happening. And, you know, when I want people to make sure that they understand that they have all the right to call for censorship. It is part of their free speech right. We should champion that and protect it. But when you do those things, they can have real consequences. And when you look at comic books in particular, you know, the comic book code was not something that was put into place by legislation. It was put in place by the industry because of these, you know, political theater trials that they were having in Congress and these, you know, grassroots movements. And that's how these things are created. It's not just that the government creates them. It is that when we create a moral panic, you know, you can lead to these censorship regimes.
It's a very good point. It still is an issue, very, very present. Gordon.
Yeah, I think my one sentence would go back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is the risk or the threat from private actors like social media companies and publishers and what have you. I think that is, if I were a comic book writer, that's what I would be worried about most right now.
Terry.
I don't know if you can see it, but Wertham is dead. Semicolon. In my headcanon, Batman is a considerate lover. Semicolon. And an apolitical stance is a political stance. Don't let anybody tell you that politics don't have a place in X, because as we discussed, it's all politics. So as a creator, if you're creating, if you're making comics, you should, on the one hand, not be afraid to express your views, and on the other, not fall into the trap of saying, well, for the sake of not ruffling feathers or, keeping the peace, I'm going to stay away from whatever, because that in itself is taking a stand and having a position on that very thing.
Excellent. No, good points, and also very good use of a semicolon. Very nicely done to keep everything in one sentence. And Betsy.
Okay, so this is kind of inspired by a trend that I've seen throughout my work in comics and CBLDF. Comics are just as valid a form of literature as prose.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the challenges we continue to see in schools are inspired by the idea that comics are lesser than, and no, they require just as sophisticated, if not more sophisticated reading skills. They present ideas in a way that are much more palatable oftentimes than prose. And they are an effective tool for reluctant readers and kids who just don't like reading all those words. And an effective tool in helping kids understand language and emotion and the way we interact with each other. So comics are just as valid as prose.
Excellent point. And I want to thank all of you, because it's, yes, comics matter. Comics are an integral part of, just as they inspire different kinds of movies now, they've taken over the movie industry. They really are, as Betsy said, they're the core in many ways of modern culture, and engaging words and pictures is important. And you're right, Terry, Wortham is dead, and there's something, he's dead, he's gone, but censorship continues, as Jackie said, and it's something that takes many forms, from governments to governments putting pressure on social media companies, to social media companies taking action on their own. So thank you all for your insightful discussion of the current challenges. And we're delighted to have you here with CBLDF. Thanks to all of you who attended the session, and to all of you who are going to be watching it through YouTube, where we're going to be posting it soon. Thanks again. We wish you all the best. And I guess the 4th of July holiday is coming up, so I hope you have an excellent 4th as well, as we celebrate democracy and the nurseries of democracy, including schools. And by the way, I know this is a silly note, but when I read Nurseries of Democracy, for some reason, the first thing that came in my mind was Muppet Babies. It just seemed to be an interesting image. But thank you all so much for participating in this event. And we look forward to seeing you at future events of the CBLDF and these wonderful organizations, FIRE, the NCAC, CRNI, doing amazing work to promote freedom of speech. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.